The flour sack hit the counter with a thud, and Helena Tucker's heart sank as she counted the coins left in her mother's worn leather purse, barely enough for next month's rent, let alone the fabric she'd been dreaming about for her wedding dress. It was March 1882 in Socorro, New Mexico, and the spring winds carried dust through every crack in the general store's wooden walls as she stood there, 20 years old, and trying not to cry in front of Mrs. Henderson, who was measuring out the white flour with practiced efficiency. "That'll be 60 cents, dear," Mrs. Henderson said kindly, her weathered face softening as she noticed Helena's trembling hands. "You doing all right? You look pale as a ghost." Helena forced a smile and nodded, though everything felt wrong. Her father had died 6 months ago in a mining accident up in the mountains, leaving her and her mother to run their small boarding house on the edge of town. The money he'd saved for Helena's wedding money that was supposed to buy beautiful fabric from the catalog, lace from back east, and all the things a proper bride should have had gone to paying his medical bills and the undertaker. Now, with her wedding to Samuel Brooks only 2 months away, she had nothing but practical concerns and fading dreams. "I'm fine, thank you," Helena managed, gathering the heavy flour sack in her arms. The white cotton was smooth and clean, stamped with the mill's mark in fading blue ink. She'd have to transfer the flour to the kitchen tin when she got home, and then this sack would join the others in the storage room, waiting to be cut up for dish towels or cleaning rags. Practical. Everything in her life had become so dreadfully practical. The bell above the door chimed as she turned to leave, and she nearly collided with a tall figure stepping inside. Strong hands caught the flour sack before it could slip from her grasp, steadying both her and her burden with an easy strength that made her look up in surprise. "Careful there, miss," a deep voice said, and Helena found herself staring into the most striking green eyes she'd ever seen, set in a sun-bronzed face beneath the brim of a dusty brown Stetson. The man was perhaps 24 or 25, with dark hair that needed cutting and a few days' worth of stubble along his strong jaw. He wore the practical clothes of a working cowboy, worn denim, a faded blue shirt, leather chaps marked with the stains of long days in the saddle, and a bandana knotted loosely around his neck. "Thank you," Helena breathed, suddenly very aware that his hands were still on the flour sack, brushing against her own. "I should have been watching where I was going. No harm done." He smiled, and something in that smile made her stomach flutter in a way that felt entirely inappropriate for a woman engaged to be married. "Let me help you with that. Looks heavy." "I can manage," she said quickly, but he'd already taken the sack from her arms, hefting it as though it weighed nothing at all. "I'm sure you can, but my mama would skin me alive if I let a lady struggle with a burden I could easily carry. Where are you headed?" Helena hesitated, propriety warring with practicality. It was a long walk back to the boarding house, and the flour sack really was heavy. "The Tucker boarding house just past the church on Mesquite Street." "I know it," he said, tipping his hat to Mrs. Henderson, who was watching the exchange with undisguised interest. "I'll walk you there." Before Helena could protest further, he was holding the door open with his boot, waiting for her to precede him into the dusty street. The afternoon sun was bright and warm, promising the hot summer that would soon bake the New Mexico territory into shades of gold and brown. Socorro sprawled around them, a town of perhaps 2,000 souls, with adobe buildings mixing with newer wooden structures, false-fronted stores lining the main street, and the distant mountains rising purple and majestic against the endless blue sky. "I'm Garrett Jensen," the cowboy said as they walked, his long strides shortening to match her pace. "Just hired on at the Rockingham Ranch about 10 miles north of town." Helena Tucker, she replied, acutely conscious of the curious stares they were attracting from the townspeople they passed. How long have you been in Socorro? About a week. Came up from Texas looking for work. The Rocking M needed experienced hands for the spring roundup, and I needed a place to settle for a while. He glanced down at her, and she saw something in his eyes, a weariness perhaps, or a wariness that spoke of harder times. Gets tiring, moving from place to place. A man wants to put down roots eventually. I've lived here my whole life, Helena said. Can't imagine being anywhere else, though sometimes I wonder what it would be like to see more of the world. She caught herself, surprised that she'd admitted such a thing to a complete stranger. Samuel certainly never wanted to hear about her dreams of seeing California or the great cities back east. World's not as glamorous as it seems in the storybooks, Garrett said quietly. But it's got its moments of beauty, I'll grant you that. Nothing quite like watching the sun rise over the prairie, or seeing a herd of wild horses running free across open country. They'd reached the church, a modest adobe structure with a wooden cross mounted above the door, and Helena pointed to the two-story building just beyond it. The Tucker boarding house was nothing fancy, just a simple wooden structure her father had built 15 years ago, with a wide porch and rooms enough for 6 boarders. The paint was peeling in places, and the roof needed patching, but it was home. "Thank you for your help, Mr. Jensen," Helena said as they climbed the porch steps. "You can set the flower just inside the door." Garrett did as she asked, but when he straightened, he didn't immediately leave. Instead, he studied her face with an intensity that made her cheeks warm. "Forgive me for being forward, Miss Tucker, but you look like you're carrying a weight heavier than any flour sack. If there's anything I can do to help, I hope you'll ask." The unexpected kindness in his voice very nearly undid her. Helena blinked hard against the sudden sting of tears and shook her head. "You're very kind, but I'm fine. Just tired, I suppose." "Helena!" "Who's there?" Her mother's voice called from inside, and a moment later Margaret Tucker appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. She was a handsome woman of 45, with the same dark blonde hair as her daughter, though streaked with silver now, and the same warm brown eyes that had grown sad since her husband's death. "This is Mr. Jensen, Mama. He was kind enough to help me carry the flower home." Margaret's eyes sharpened with interest as she took in the cowboy standing on her porch. "That was very kind of you, Mr. Jensen. Would you like to stay for supper? It's the least we can do to thank you." "Mama, I'm sure Mr. Jensen has to get back to the ranch," Helena said quickly, though part of her, a traitorous, confusing part, hoped he would say yes. "Actually, I don't have to be back until tomorrow morning," Garrett said, his eyes never leaving Helena's face. "If it's truly no trouble, Mrs. Tucker, I'd be honored to accept your invitation." Margaret beamed. "Wonderful. We eat at 6, which gives you time to wash up if you'd like. We have a pump around back." Helena fled to the kitchen, her heart pounding in a way that made no sense whatsoever. She was engaged to Samuel Brooks, the son of the town's most successful merchant. They'd been courting for nearly 2 years, and while she didn't feel the passionate love she'd read about in the dime novels her friend Mary sometimes smuggled into town, she respected Samuel. He was steady, reliable, and her marriage to him would secure her mother's future as well as her own. It was a good match, a sensible match. So why did her hands shake as she peeled potatoes for supper, remembering the way Garrett Jensen's green eyes had looked at her, as though he saw something precious and beautiful that she'd forgotten existed? "He's very handsome," Margaret commented as she joined Helena in the kitchen, beginning to slice the chicken they'd bought from Mr. Ortega's farm. "And polite. Where did you say he's working?" "The Rockingham. He's new to town." Helena focused intently on her potato peeling, not meeting her mother's knowing gaze. "It's good to make new friends," Margaret said carefully, "though I suppose Samuel might not appreciate you walking home with strange cowboys." "It was perfectly innocent, Mama. He was just being helpful." "Of course, dear. I'm sure that's all it was." But when Garrett Jensen sat down at their dinner table 2 hours later, freshly washed and with his hat hanging on the peg by the door, Helena knew it was more than simple helpfulness that had brought him there. She could feel it in the way his eyes followed her as she served the meal, in the warmth of his smile when she accidentally met his gaze, in the way her whole body seemed to hum with awareness whenever he spoke. They had 3 other boarders at the table: old Mr. Kowalski, who worked at the telegraph office, young Timothy Shaw, a clerk at the bank, and Mrs. Violet Chen, a widow who took in sewing. All 3 watched the interaction between Helena and their unexpected dinner guest with varying degrees of interest. "So you're from Texas originally, Mr. Jensen?" Timothy asked, helping himself to more potatoes. He was a slight young man of 22, with spectacles and ink-stained fingers. "Born in Austin," Garrett confirmed. "My father had a small ranch there, but we lost it after the war. I've been working cattle ever since I was old enough to sit a horse properly." "The war was a hard time for everyone," Mr. Kowalski said, his thick Polish accent making the words heavy with remembered sorrow. "I came to America in 1870, thinking to escape war and hardship. Turns out hardship follows a man wherever he goes. But we survive," Margaret said firmly. "We adapt, we carry on, and we find joy where we can. That's all anyone can do." "Wise words, Mrs. Tucker," Garrett said. "My mother used to say something similar. She passed 5 years ago, but I still hear her voice sometimes, reminding me to look for the light even in dark times." Helena found herself drawn into conversation with him throughout the meal, discovering that he'd traveled all through Texas, up to Kansas with the cattle drives, and even spent a year in Colorado trying his hand at prospecting, before admitting he was a cattleman at heart and always would be. He told stories that made them all laugh, tales of ornery longhorns and temperamental horses, of thunderstorms on the prairie and nights spent under stars so thick they looked like diamond dust scattered across black velvet. "You should have been a writer, Mr. Jensen," Mrs. Chen said, her elegant hands folded in her lap. She was a tiny woman with silver-streaked black hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. "You paint pictures with your words." "I just tell things as I see them, madam," Garrett replied, but his eyes kept drifting back to Helena. "Though I'll admit, some sights inspire more poetry than others." After supper, Helena walked him to the door, acutely aware of her mother and the boarders making themselves scarce in a way that was anything but subtle. The evening air was cool and sweet, carrying the scent of the cottonwoods that lined the creek at the edge of town. "Thank you for the meal," Garrett said, settling his hat back on his head, "and for the company. I haven't had an evening that pleasant in longer than I can remember." "Thank you for carrying the flour," Helena replied, wishing she could think of something more clever to say, something that would make him stay just a little longer. He hesitated, then said, "Miss Tucker, I know it's not my place to ask, but are you happy?" The question caught her completely off guard. "I don't understand. Earlier today, at the store, you looked like your heart was breaking over a flour sack, and all through dinner, even when you were smiling, there was a sadness in your eyes." He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the green flecks in his eyes, close enough to smell leather and soap and something that was uniquely him. "A woman as beautiful and kind as you should never look that sad." "I'm engaged to be married," Helena blurted out, the words tumbling over themselves in her haste to put distance between them, between this moment and the dangerous feelings swirling in her chest. "In June. To Samuel Brooks," He's a very good man. Something flickered in Garrett's eyes, disappointment perhaps, or resignation. I'm sure he is. He'd have to be to deserve you. You don't even know me, she whispered. No, he agreed. But I'd like to if you'd let me. I can't. It wouldn't be right. Because you're engaged to a man you don't love. It wasn't a question. Helena's breath caught. I never said that. You didn't have to. Garrett reached out and gently tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, the gesture so tender it made her ache. But I'll respect your wishes, Miss Tucker. I won't trouble you again. I hope you'll be very happy with Mr. Brooks. He turned and walked away, and Helena stood on the porch watching him go, her hand pressed to the spot where his fingers had brushed her skin, feeling as though something vital and precious was walking out of her life before she'd even had a chance to discover what it might have been. The next 2 weeks passed in a haze of wedding preparations that felt increasingly surreal. Samuel came by the boarding house 3 times, each visit marked by his careful discussion of practical matters where they would live. In the house his father was giving them as a wedding present. How the household finances would be managed. Samuel would control all money, as was proper. What Helena's duties would be. Managing the home, entertaining his business associates, producing children in due course. I've been thinking about the wedding dress, Samuel said during his 3rd visit, sitting stiffly in the parlor while Helena served him tea. He was a man of 28, with thinning brown hair, pale blue eyes, and a perpetually serious expression. My mother suggests you visit Mrs. Morrison's dressmaking shop. She can create something suitable, nothing too elaborate, of course. We don't want people thinking we're putting on airs. Actually, Samuel, I've been thinking I might make my own dress, Helena said quietly, to save money. Samuel frowned. The Brooks family doesn't need to save money on our wedding, Helena. What would people think? That we're practical and sensible, she suggested, though she knew it was the wrong thing to say even as the words left her mouth. They would think I couldn't afford to properly dress my own bride, Samuel said coldly. I'll arrange for you to see Mrs. Morrison next week. She'll know what's appropriate. After he left, Helena sat alone in the parlor, staring at her hands folded in her lap, and tried to remember when she'd agreed to marry this man who made her feel like a piece of furniture to be arranged according to his specifications. The answer came easily. She'd agreed last summer, when her father was dying and medical bills were piling up, and Samuel had offered stability and security at a time when her world was crumbling. He'd been kind then, or at least not unkind, and she'd been too overwhelmed with grief to pay attention to the details of his personality. You look miserable, dear, Margaret said, entering the parlor with her sewing basket. She settled into her favorite chair and took out the shirt she was mending for Mr. Kowalski. Having second thoughts, is it wrong that I am? Helena asked miserably. Samuel's a good man. He'll provide for us. Isn't that what matters? Is it what matters to you? Helena thought about Garrett Jensen's smile, about the way he'd looked at her as though she was someone extraordinary, about the stories he'd told that made the world seem larger and more full of possibility than she'd ever imagined. Then she thought about the practical realities of her life, the boarding house they could barely afford to maintain, her mother's health growing frailer each year, the security that marriage to Samuel would provide. It has to be, she said finally. It's too late to change course now. The banns have been posted, the invitations sent, the arrangements made. And even if I wanted to break the engagement, what would I do? Live here forever, taking in boarders, growing old without a family of my own. You could marry for love instead of obligation, Margaret suggested gently. Strange things have been known to happen. I don't have any other prospects, Mama, and Samuel is. She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence honestly. Not the man you dream about, Margaret finished for her. I know, sweetheart. I see it in your face every time he visits. You look like you're facing a prison sentence, not a wedding. Then what should I do? Helena's voice broke. Tell me what to do, Mama, but Margaret just shook her head. This is your life, Helena, your choice. I can't make it for you, much as I might want to spare you the pain of making it yourself. That Sunday, Helena attended church services and tried very hard to focus on Pastor Williams's sermon about faith and trust in God's plan. Samuel sat beside her, his posture perfect, his attention seemingly fixed on the pastor's words, though Helena suspected he was actually calculating the week's receipts from his father's store in his head. On her other side, her mother hummed along quietly with the hymns, her voice still sweet despite the years. After the service, as the congregation mingled outside in the sunshine, Helena saw Garrett Jensen standing at the edge of the crowd, looking uncertain and out of place in clothes that were clearly his best, but still marked him as a working cowboy among the town's more prosperous citizens. Her heart did that strange flutter-jump thing it had done the day they met, and before she could stop herself, she was crossing the dusty yard toward him. "Mr. Jensen," she said, very aware that half the congregation was probably watching. "I didn't know you attended services here." "First time," he admitted, his eyes lighting up at the sight of her. "Thought it was time I started making connections in town, putting down those roots I mentioned, though I'll confess I was hoping I might see you here." "Helena," Samuel's voice cut across the yard, sharp with displeasure. He appeared at her elbow, his hand closing possessively around her arm. "Who is this?" "Samuel, this is Garrett Jensen. He works at the Rockingham Ranch. Mr. Jensen, this is my fiancé, Samuel Brooks." The two men measured each other with the instant wariness of dogs meeting on disputed territory. Samuel was taller by an inch or two, but Garrett had the lean, hard build of a man who'd spent his life doing physical labor, while Samuel's frame was softer, shaped by hours behind a counter rather than in the saddle. "Mr. Brooks," Garrett said evenly, offering his hand. "Congratulations on your engagement. Miss Tucker is a remarkable woman." Samuel ignored the offered hand. "Yes, she is, and I'm very protective of her. I'm sure you understand." "Perfectly." Garrett's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "I meant no disrespect." "See that you continue to mean none. Helena, we should go. Mother is expecting us for Sunday dinner." Helena allowed herself to be led away, but she glanced back once and saw Garrett still standing there, watching her with an expression that made her chest ache. She wanted to run back to him, to apologize for Samuel's rudeness, to explain that she wasn't usually so cowardly about her own life. Instead, she sat through 3 hours of awkward dinner conversation with Samuel's parents, where his mother criticized everything from Helena's dress to her table manners, and his father lectured about the importance of maintaining proper social standards in frontier communities. "You'll need to improve your wardrobe once you're married," Mrs. Brooks said, eyeing Helena's simple blue Sunday dress with obvious disapproval. "The wife of a successful merchant must look the part. I'll take you shopping next week." "That's very kind of you, Mrs. Brooks, but I can sew my own clothes," Helena offered. "Homemade clothing is fine for a girl from a boarding house," Mrs. Brooks sniffed. "But you'll be a Brooks soon. We have standards to maintain." Samuel said nothing in defense of her, just nodded agreement with his mother's pronouncements, and Helena felt something inside her grow cold and hard. This was her future, a lifetime of being molded into whatever shape the Brooks family deemed acceptable, of having her own thoughts and feelings dismissed as inconsequential, of slow suffocation by respectability. That night, unable to sleep, she went down to the kitchen and lit a lamp. The flour sacks from her recent purchases were still stacked in the storage room, waiting to be repurposed. On impulse, she pulled one out and spread it on the kitchen table, studying the smooth white cotton in the lamplight. It wasn't fancy fabric, but it was clean and sturdy, and there was something honest about it that appealed to her in a way that Mrs. Morrison's elaborate creations never could. "Can't sleep either." Margaret appeared in the doorway, wrapped in her dressing gown. "I was just thinking," Helena said slowly, her fingers tracing the faded blue mill stamp on the flour sack, "about what makes something beautiful. Is it expensive fabric and fancy lace, or is it something else? Something that comes from the heart rather than from a store?" Margaret moved to stand beside her daughter, looking down at the simple flour sack. "I made my wedding dress from flour sacks," she said quietly. "Did I ever tell you that?" Helena looked up in surprise. "No, I always assumed you'd bought fabric. We couldn't afford it. Your grandfather was a farmer, and times were hard. But I was determined to be married in something white and pure, so I saved up flour sacks for 6 months, washed them until the mill stamps faded to almost nothing, and sewed them together into the prettiest dress I could manage. Your father said I was the most beautiful bride he'd ever seen, and he meant it, not because the dress was fancy, but because I'd poured my heart into making it." Helena felt tears prick her eyes. "I wish Papa was here." "So do I, sweetheart. He'd know what to tell you right now, how to help you see clearly what you need to do." "What do you think I should do, Mama?" Helena whispered. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, then said, "I think you should make your wedding dress from these flour sacks. And while you're sewing it, I think you should ask yourself whether you're making it for the right man." Over the next 3 weeks, Helena threw herself into creating her wedding dress. She collected flour sacks from every purchase, washed them in hot water with soap and a little lye until the mill stamps faded to pale ghosts, then carefully cut and pieced them together according to a pattern she found in an old Godey's Lady's book. The work was meticulous and time-consuming, requiring all her skill with a needle to make the seams invisible and the drape graceful. She saw Garrett occasionally around town, glimpses of him on horseback, riding in with other cowboys from the Rocking M, or standing outside the feed store, or once walking past the boarding house, his eyes lifting to the windows as though hoping to catch sight of her. Each time, her heart ached with the weight of things unsaid and paths not taken. Samuel continued his regular visits, each one reinforcing her growing certainty that she was making a terrible mistake. He criticized the idea of a homemade wedding dress, called her foolish for wasting time on such a project when Mrs. Morrison could do better work, and grew increasingly irritable when she defended her choice. "You're being stubborn and irrational," he said during one particularly tense visit. "This is exactly the kind of behavior you'll need to correct once we're married. A wife should defer to her husband's judgment in all things." "I thought a marriage was supposed to be a partnership," Helena replied, her hands clenched in her lap to keep them from shaking. "A partnership where one partner knows better than the other," Samuel corrected coldly. "You're young and inexperienced, Helena. You need guidance." After he left, Helena went to her room and looked at the wedding dress taking shape on her dressmaker's form. The flour sack cotton had proven surprisingly lovely, once properly prepared, soft and white and honest. She designed the dress with a fitted bodice, long sleeves, and a full skirt that fell in graceful folds to the floor. It wasn't elaborate, but it was beautiful in its simplicity, and every stitch represented hours of work and thought. The problem was that with each stitch, she'd been thinking not of Samuel but of green eyes and a warm smile, of stories told by lamplight, and the gentle way a cowboy's roughened hand had tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "I've made a terrible mess of things," she confessed to Mary Patterson, her closest friend, when Mary came to visit one afternoon in early May. Mary was a lively redhead of 21 who worked in her parents' restaurant and had opinions on everything. "Then unmake the mess," Mary said practically, examining the nearly completed wedding dress. "This is gorgeous, by the way. Much prettier than anything Mrs. Morrison makes. I can't just call off the wedding, Mary. Everyone in town knows about it. The Brooks family would be humiliated. My reputation would be ruined." "Better a ruined reputation than a ruined life," Mary said. "And for what it's worth, everyone in town also knows about the handsome cowboy who's been pining after you. Mrs. Henderson told my mother, who told Mrs. Chen, who told me that Mr. Jensen asks about you every time he comes into the general store. Apparently, he wanted to know if you seemed happy, if your fiancé treated you well, if there was any chance you might change your mind about getting married." Helena's breath caught. "He said all that?" "According to Mrs. Henderson. And she also said she's never seen a man look more heartsick in all her years of running that store." Mary grabbed Helena's hands. "Listen to me, Helena Tucker. I've known you since we were girls playing in the creek behind your father's boarding house. I've never seen you look at Samuel Brooks the way you light up when someone mentions Garrett Jensen. If you marry Samuel, you'll spend the rest of your life wondering what might have been. Is that really what you want? But Mama needs security. The boarding house barely pays for itself. If I marry Samuel, your mother would be taken care of, yes, but she'd also have to watch her daughter be miserable for the next 50 years. You think that's what she wants? She loved your father, Helena, really loved him. She knows the difference between duty and devotion, and she wants devotion for you." Helena closed her eyes, feeling the truth of Mary's words settle into her bones. She thought about her mother's story of making her own wedding dress from flour sacks, about her father's words that she was the most beautiful bride he'd ever seen. That was the kind of love she wanted, the kind that saw beauty in simplicity, that valued effort over expense, that treasured the person beneath the wedding dress rather than the dress itself. "I have to end it with Samuel," she said aloud, and felt simultaneously terrified and relieved. "But what if Garrett doesn't actually care for me that way? What if Mrs. Henderson was wrong, or what if he's lost interest, or what if you're just scared?" Mary interrupted gently. "Which is perfectly reasonable, but you can be scared and still be brave. That's what courage is, isn't it?" 2 days later, Helena invited Samuel to the boarding house parlor and served him tea with hands that trembled so badly she nearly dropped the pot. He sat in his usual chair, looking impatient and distracted, checking his pocket watch twice before she'd even begun to speak. "Samuel, I need to tell you something," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been doing a lot of thinking about our engagement. If this is about the wedding dress again, Helena, I've already told you I can't marry you," she said, the words rushing out before she lost her courage entirely. "I'm so sorry, Samuel. I know this is terribly unfair to you, and I know I should have realized sooner, but I can't marry you. I don't love you the way a wife should love her husband, and I don't think you really love me either. We'd both be miserable." Samuel stared at her as though she'd spoken in a foreign language. "Don't be ridiculous. Of course we're getting married. The wedding is in 4 weeks. I know, and I'm sorry for the short notice, but it would be even worse to wait until after the wedding to discover we'd made a mistake." "You're hysterical," Samuel said flatly. "Women often become irrational before their weddings. You'll feel differently tomorrow." "No, I won't." Helena drew a deep breath and met his eyes. "I'm ending our engagement, Samuel. I'm sorry." His face flushed dark red. "You stupid girl. Do you have any idea what you're throwing away? My family was willing to overlook your background, your poverty, the fact that you work in a boarding house like a common servant. We were willing to raise you up to our level, and this is how you repay us." "I'm grateful for your consideration," Helena said, her voice steadier now. "But I can't marry someone who sees marrying me as an act of charity. You deserve someone who fits into your family's world naturally, and I deserve someone who loves me for who I am, not despite it." "This is about that cowboy, isn't it?" Samuel's voice turned ugly. "That drifter from the Rockingham. Don't think I haven't seen how you look at him, how he looks at you. You're throwing away a solid future for a man who'll probably move on to the next town in 6 months." "This isn't about Garrett Jensen," Helena lied. "This is about us and the fact that we don't love each other." "Love," Samuel spat the word like a curse. "Love doesn't pay bills or put food on the table. You're going to regret this, Helena. You and your mother both will, when you're scraping by on the pennies that boarding house brings in." "That's our concern, not yours," Margaret's voice cut across the room. She'd been standing in the doorway, and now she moved to stand beside her daughter, her hand resting protectively on Helena's shoulder. "I believe Helena has made herself clear, Mr. Brooks. I'll thank you to leave our home." Samuel stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You'll both be sorry. Everyone in this town will know what kind of woman Helena Tucker really is, the kind who breaks her promises and chases after cowboys like a common." "That's enough," Margaret said sharply. "Leave now, or I'll have Mr. Kowalski fetch the sheriff." After Samuel stormed out, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows, Helena collapsed onto the settee and burst into tears. Margaret held her while she cried, stroking her hair and murmuring comfort, and gradually the storm of emotion passed, leaving Helena feeling wrung out but somehow lighter than she had in months. "Did I just destroy our lives?" she asked, her voice muffled against her mother's shoulder. "You just saved both our lives," Margaret corrected firmly. "Oh, sweetheart, I'm so proud of you. I know that took courage. What do we do now? Now you finish that beautiful dress you've been making. And then you decide whether you want to wear it for yourself, or whether you want to give a certain cowboy a chance to tell you that you're the most beautiful bride he's ever seen." The news spread through Socorro like wildfire, just as Helena had known it would. Samuel and his family made sure everyone knew that Helena Tucker had jilted their son mere weeks before the wedding. And while they were too socially conscious to spread the rumors about Garrett Jensen themselves, plenty of other tongues wagged with speculation about the handsome cowboy from the Rockingham and the boarding house girl who'd thrown away her chance at respectability. Helena endured the stares and whispers with as much dignity as she could muster, holding her head high when she went to the general store or the bank or church, refusing to act ashamed of her choice even when Mrs. Brooks cut her dead in the street, and several of her mother's more respectable friends stopped calling at the boarding house. "Let them talk," Mary said fiercely. "They're all just jealous because they're stuck in loveless marriages themselves. You're the bravest person I know." But as the days passed, and Helena worked on finishing her wedding dress because she was determined to complete it, even if she never wore it, she began to wonder if Samuel had been right about one thing. She hadn't seen Garrett Jensen since, before she'd broken her engagement. The few times she'd gone into town, she'd looked for him without meaning to, her eyes scanning the streets and the saloon steps and the hitching posts outside the general store, but he was nowhere to be found. "Maybe he went back to Texas," she said miserably to her mother one evening, carefully hemming the dress's skirt. "Maybe he heard about the broken engagement and decided he didn't want anything to do with the scandal. Or maybe he's waiting to make sure enough time has passed to be respectful," Margaret suggested. "Not every man rushes in the moment an opportunity presents itself. Some of them have manners. Or maybe he never really cared and Mrs. Henderson was wrong, and I've ruined my life for nothing." Helena Marie Tucker, stop feeling sorry for yourself this instant, Margaret said sharply. You ended that engagement because marrying Samuel Brooks would have made you miserable, not because you were guaranteed a different outcome. Even if Garrett Jensen never speaks to you again, you still made the right choice. Your life belongs to you, not to some man, any man. Remember that. Helena nodded, chastened, and bent back over her sewing. Her mother was right, of course. She'd made her choice and would live with the consequences, whatever they might be. The wedding dress was nearly complete now, and it had turned out even more beautiful than she'd hoped. The flower sack cotton had a soft, lustrous quality after all her careful washing and pressing, and the simple design let the fabric's honest beauty shine through. She'd added tiny mother-of-pearl buttons down the back, her one extravagance, purchased with money saved from taking in extra mending, and fashioned a matching veil from a piece of fine cotton lawn that Mrs. Chen had given her as a gift. It's a dress for a woman who knows her own worth, Mrs. Chen had said when she saw the nearly completed gown, and who doesn't need expensive fabric to prove it? On the first Saturday in June, what would have been her wedding day to Samuel Brooks, Helena finished the last stitch on her dress and held it up to the light streaming through her bedroom window. It was perfect, simple, honest, and beautiful. She'd made something meaningful from humble materials, just as her mother had done 26 years ago, and no matter what happened next, she would always be proud of that accomplishment. I'm going for a walk, she told her mother, hanging the dress carefully in her wardrobe and changing into her everyday clothes. I need some air. Socorro was drowsy in the afternoon heat, with most people taking their siesta or staying inside where it was cooler. Helena walked without any real destination in mind, her feet carrying her past the church and the general store, past the small houses on the edge of town and out toward the creek that marked the boundary between settlement and open range. She'd always loved this spot. The cottonwoods provided shade, and there was a flat rock perfect for sitting and watching the water flow past. She was so lost in her thoughts that she didn't hear the footsteps behind her until a familiar voice said, "I hoped I might find you here." Helena spun around and found Garrett Jensen standing a few feet away, his hat in his hands, looking nervous and determined in equal measure. He was dusty from riding, his clothes marked with the stains of honest work, and he was the most wonderful thing she'd ever seen. "Mr. Jensen," she breathed, "I thought you'd left town." "I've been giving you space," he said, moving closer. "Didn't want to cause you more trouble than I already have. Heard you broke your engagement, heard there was talk about it being my fault. It wasn't your fault. It was mine, for agreeing to marry someone I didn't love in the first place. But I didn't help matters, did I? Showing up in your life, making you question your choices." Helena found herself smiling despite everything. "No, you didn't help at all. You made everything complicated and confusing and difficult. I'm sorry for that." He took another step closer, close enough now that she could see the darker green flecks in his eyes, the day's worth of stubble on his jaw, the way his hands clenched nervously on the brim of his hat. "Except I'm not sorry, not really, because watching you marry another man would have killed something inside me." "Garrett," she whispered, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break free from her chest. "I know I'm not what anyone would call a good prospect," he continued, the words tumbling out as though he'd been holding them back for weeks and couldn't contain them any longer. "I'm just a cowboy, and I don't have much to my name except a good horse, a decent saddle, and my pay from the rocking em. But I'm a hard worker, and I'm honest, and I would spend every day of my life making sure you knew you were cherished and valued and loved. I would never try to make you into something you're not, never dismiss your thoughts or feelings, never treat you like anything less than the extraordinary woman you are. Garrett, Helena said again, but he kept talking, as though afraid that if he stopped, he'd lose his courage. I fell in love with you the moment I caught that flour sack in the general store and looked into your eyes. I've tried to talk myself out of it 100 times, told myself you were engaged, that I had no right to interfere, that I should just move on to the next town like I always do. But I can't, Helena, I can't move on from you. You're in my blood now, in my bones, and I'll spend the rest of my life alone before I'll settle for someone who isn't you. Are you finished? Helena asked, her eyes bright with tears. He looked uncertain. I suppose so. Unless you want me to keep going, because I could probably come up with a few more reasons why you should give me a chance. I don't need more reasons, Helena said, closing the distance between them and placing her hands on his chest, feeling the rapid beat of his heart beneath her palms. I just needed to hear you say you loved me, because I've been in love with you since you carried my flour sack home and looked at me like I mattered. The smile that broke across Garrett's face was like sunrise after a long, dark night. You matter more than anything in this world, he said, his hands coming up to frame her face with infinite gentleness. You're everything, Helena. Everything. When he kissed her, it felt like coming home and setting out on an adventure all at once, safe and thrilling, comfortable and electric. Helena wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him back with all the pent-up longing of the past 2 months, and when they finally broke apart, both breathless and slightly dazed, she found herself laughing with pure joy. I made a wedding dress, she said, out of flour sacks. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever created, and I'd very much like to wear it to marry you if you're asking what I think you're asking. I'm asking, Garrett confirmed, pulling her close again. Though I should warn you, being married to a cowboy isn't going to be easy. The pay's not great, the work is hard, and there will be times when we have to count our pennies carefully. I grew up in a boarding house, Helena reminded him. I know all about counting pennies, and I'd rather be poor with you than rich with anyone else. We might not always be poor, Garrett said thoughtfully. I've been saving my pay, and Mr. Montgomery at the Rocking M mentioned he might be willing to sell me a piece of his land eventually if I can come up with the down payment. Nothing fancy, just enough acres for a small herd and a house. We could build something together, Helena, something that's really ours. I'd like that, Helena said softly. I'd like that very much. They were married 3 weeks later in the little adobe church, on a bright June morning when the New Mexico sky was so blue it hurt to look at directly. Pastor Williams performed the ceremony, and the church was surprisingly full despite the scandal. Mary Patterson was there, of course, beaming with satisfaction at having been proven right, and Mrs. Chen and Mr. Kowalski and Timothy Shaw from the boarding house, and Mrs. Henderson from the general store, and several of the cowboys from the Rocking M who'd become Garrett's friends, and even Mr. Montgomery himself, Garrett's employer, who'd taken the day off from ranch work to attend. Helena's wedding dress rustled softly as she walked down the aisle on her mother's arm, the flour sack cotton gleaming white in the light streaming through the church's small windows. She'd pinned wildflowers in her hair, bright yellow prairie sunflowers and delicate white evening primrose that Garrett had picked for her that morning, and she carried a simple bouquet of the same flowers tied with a ribbon. But the only thing she really saw was Garrett, standing at the altar in his best clothes, his face transformed by a smile of such love and wonder that she felt tears prick her eyes. When she reached his side and he took her hands in his, he leaned close and whispered, "You're the most beautiful bride I've ever seen." The words were the same ones her father had said to her mother all those years ago, the words that made a dress of flour sacks into something precious and meaningful. And Helena felt her heart swell with so much happiness she thought it might overflow. "You're the answer to every prayer I never knew to say," she whispered back, and watched his green eyes grow bright with emotion. Pastor Williams cleared his throat gently. "Shall we begin?" The ceremony was simple and heartfelt, the words of the traditional marriage service taking on new meaning as Helena and Garrett spoke their vows to each other. When Garrett slipped the plain gold band onto her finger, another piece of his careful savings, spent on something that would last forever, Helena felt as though everything in her life had been leading to this moment, to this man, to this new beginning. "I now pronounce you man and wife," Pastor Williams intoned. "Mr. Jensen, you may kiss your bride." Garrett cupped her face in his hands, his touch gentle and reverent. "Mrs. Jensen," he murmured, as though testing the name, savoring it. Then he kissed her, soft and sweet and full of promise, and the small congregation erupted in cheers and applause. The celebration afterward was held at the boarding house, with Margaret and Mrs. Chen and Mary all working together to provide a wedding breakfast of scrambled eggs, bacon, fresh biscuits, and a cake that Mary's mother had donated from the restaurant. It wasn't fancy, but it was generous and warm, filled with laughter and well wishes from the people who truly cared about Helena and Garrett's happiness. "To the bride and groom," Mr. Montgomery said, raising his glass of cider. "May your life together be filled with love, prosperity, and all the happiness you both deserve." "Here, here," chorused the gathering, and Helena found herself blinking back tears again as she looked around at these good people who'd stood by her even when others had turned away. Samuel Brooks and his family were notably absent, of course, and there were several other members of Socorro's more respectable society who declined to attend. But Helena found she didn't care. She had her mother, her friends, and most importantly, she had Garrett, his hand warm in hers, his eyes never leaving her face, his presence beside her feeling like the answer to every question she'd ever asked about what her life should be. After the breakfast, as the party began to wind down, Garrett borrowed a wagon from Mr. Montgomery and drove Helena out to the Rocking M Ranch to show her the small cabin that would be their first home. It was just one room plus a tiny lean-to kitchen, but it was clean and sturdy, with a good roof and a stone fireplace that Garrett had spent his spare time improving. "It's not much right now," he said, helping her down from the wagon and keeping his arm around her waist as they surveyed the humble dwelling. "But it's ours, rent-free as part of my wages. And eventually, when we save enough, we'll build something bigger on our own land." "It's perfect," Helena said honestly, seeing not what it was but what it would become, a home filled with love and laughter, a place to build the life they'd both been dreaming of. "Show me inside." The cabin's interior was sparse but clean, with a bed frame that Garrett had built himself, a small table and 2 chairs, a trunk for their belongings, and little else. But there were curtains on the window, blue gingham that Helena recognized as Mrs. Chen's handiwork, and a colorful rag rug on the floor that her mother must have contributed, and a vase of wildflowers on the table that made Helena's throat tighten with emotion. "Everyone wanted to help make it welcoming for you," Garrett explained, looking slightly embarrassed. "Mrs. Chen brought the curtains. Your mother made the rug, and Mary insisted on leaving fresh flowers. I told them it wasn't necessary, but they wouldn't listen." "They love us," Helena said simply, "and they wanted us to start our life together knowing we have people who care about our happiness." Garrett pulled her close, resting his chin on top of her head. "I never expected this, you know. To find a place where I belonged, people who felt like family, a woman who makes me want to be better than I ever thought I could be. I've spent years drifting from place to place, never putting down roots because nothing ever felt like home. But this feels like home." Helena tilted her face up to kiss him. Then we'll make this place into everything we've both been searching for, together." They spent their first afternoon as husband and wife arranging their few possessions and talking about their plans for the future. Garrett explained that his position at the Rocking M was secure as long as he wanted it. Mr. Montgomery had told him he was one of the best hands he'd ever hired, reliable and skilled with both horses and cattle. The pay was modest but steady, $30 a month plus room and board, and Garrett had already managed to save nearly $200 toward the day when they could afford land of their own. "Mr. Montgomery said he'd be willing to sell us 100 acres on the southern edge of his property," Garrett explained, his eyes alight with enthusiasm. "Good grazing land with a creek running through it and enough timber for building. He'd want $500 for it, which sounds like a fortune right now, but if I keep working and we're careful with our money, we could have it in maybe 3 years. "I can work too," Helena said. "I could take in sewing or laundry or—" "You could," Garrett agreed, "but you don't have to. I want to provide for you, Helena. I want you to have the chance to make our home beautiful, to have time for the things you enjoy, to not spend every waking hour working yourself to exhaustion. My mother and I ran the boarding house together for years," Helena reminded him gently. "I'm not afraid of hard work. I know you're not, but there's a difference between working because you have to and working because you want to. I'd like to give you the choice, that's all." Helena felt her heart melt a little more. Samuel had never cared what she wanted, in fact, seemed to view her desires as irrelevant inconveniences to be managed. But Garrett spoke of her happiness as though it mattered as much as his own, as though building a life together meant both of them getting to shape what that life looked like. "Then I'll think about what I'd like to do," she said. "But whatever we decide together. Equal partners, remember, equal partners," Garrett agreed, sealing the promise with a kiss. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, Helena discovered that married life with Garrett was everything she'd hoped and more. They fell into an easy rhythm, Garrett rising before dawn to tend to his duties at the ranch, Helena managing their small household and walking into town several times a week to help her mother at the boarding house, both of them coming together in the evenings to share meals and conversation, and the quiet joy of simply being together. The work wasn't always easy. There were days when Garrett came home exhausted and sore from long hours in the saddle, days when Helena struggled with the isolation of ranch life after growing up in the bustle of a boarding house, days when their budget was stretched thin and they had to carefully consider every purchase. But through it all, their love remained steady and strong, a foundation they could build on no matter what challenges they faced. Helena did eventually decide to take in sewing, not because they desperately needed the money, but because she discovered she enjoyed the creative work and the connection it gave her to the women of Socorro. Word spread quickly that Mrs. Jensen had made her own beautiful wedding dress from flour sacks, and soon other women were coming to her for practical, attractive clothing that didn't require expensive fabric or pretentious designs. "You have a gift," Mrs. Chen told her, examining a dress Helena had made for a rancher's wife. "You see the potential in simple materials and make them into something special. That's a rare talent." "I learned from watching my mother make do with what we had," Helena said, "and from making my wedding dress. I realized that beauty doesn't have to be expensive to be real." Her business grew slowly but steadily, and within 6 months, she was contributing nearly as much to their savings as Garrett did, stitching away in the evenings while he read aloud to her from the books they borrowed from Pastor Williams's small lending library. They read everything from Charles Dickens to Mark Twain, from poetry to adventure stories, and Helena loved these quiet hours as much as any grand romantic gesture, just the two of them. comfortable in their small cabin, sharing words and dreams and the occasional kiss when the story got too exciting or too sad to bear without physical comfort. They made friends among the other ranch families, attending community dances in town and church socials, and the occasional barn raising or quilting bee. Garrett proved popular among the other cowboys for his skills and his willingness to help anyone who needed it, and Helena found herself welcomed into circles that had previously been closed to the daughter of a boarding house owner. The Brooks family still snubbed them, of course, but Helena found she didn't care. She'd rather have genuine warmth from working families than false courtesy from people who valued money over kindness. Margaret remained at the boarding house, though Helena and Garrett urged her to consider moving out to the ranch with them. "I'm not ready to give up my independence just yet," Margaret said with a smile. "Besides, you two newlyweds don't need an old woman interfering in your lives. I'm perfectly content where I am." But when Margaret fell ill with pneumonia that first winter, Helena moved back into the boarding house temporarily to nurse her mother through the worst of it. Garrett visited every day after his work was done, often bringing fresh meat or firewood or other supplies, and he sat by Margaret's bedside reading to her in his deep, soothing voice while Helena cooked or cleaned or collapsed into exhausted sleep. "You're a good man, Garrett Jensen," Margaret told him one evening when she was finally on the mend. "My daughter chose well." "I'm the one who got lucky," Garrett replied. "She could have done much better than a cowboy with more dreams than money." "Money comes and goes," Margaret said firmly. "But a man who loves my daughter the way you do, that's worth more than all the gold in California. Don't you forget it." Spring came eventually, as it always does, bringing with it warmth and new grass and the busy season of roundup and branding. Garrett worked longer hours during this time, sometimes gone for days when the rocking hands drove cattle to far pastures or tracked down strays in the rough country to the north. Helena missed him terribly during these absences, but she kept busy with her sewing and helping her mother, and the joy of his return always made the loneliness worthwhile. "I have news," Garrett said one evening in late May, nearly a year after their wedding. He'd been gone for 5 days on a cattle drive to the railhead in Santa Fe, and he burst into their cabin with barely contained excitement. "Mr. Montgomery made me an offer." Helena set down her sewing, her heart suddenly racing. "What kind of offer?" "He's getting older, and his son doesn't want to run the ranch, wants to go back east and study law instead. Mr. Montgomery said he'd sell us not just the 100 acres we talked about, but 200 acres, plus 10 head of breeding cattle to start our own herd. He'd carry the note himself, let us pay it off over 10 years at a fair interest rate." 200 acres, Helena breathed. "That's enough for a real ranch." "It would be hard at first," Garrett warned, but his eyes were shining. "I'd have to keep working for Mr. Montgomery for a while to make ends meet, and we'd need to build a new house and barn, and there'd be years of lean times before the herd grew enough to support us fully. But it would be ours, Helena. Our land, our cattle, our future." "How much does he want for it?" $800 total. We have 300 saved, which would be enough for the down payment he's asking. Then we'd owe him $50 a year plus interest until it's paid off." Helena did the math quickly in her head. $50 a year was manageable between Garrett's wages and her sewing income, though it wouldn't leave much room for emergencies or luxuries. But the chance to own their own land, to build something lasting that they could pass on to future children, that was worth any sacrifice. "When do we start?" she asked, and watched joy transform Garrett's face. They signed the papers with Mr. Montgomery's lawyer in early June, and suddenly they were landowners, possessors of 200 acres of New Mexico rangeland that stretched from the creek in the north to the rocky hills in the south. The land wasn't perfect, parts of it were too rough for easy grazing, and the creek ran dry in the late summer months, but it was theirs, and it was beautiful. "We'll build the house right here," Garrett said, standing on a gentle rise that offered views of both the mountains and the plains. Close enough to the creek for water, high enough to catch the breeze in summer. Maybe 4 rooms to start, with space to add on later when we need it. "When we have children," Helena said softly, laying a hand over her still flat stomach. She hadn't told him yet, hadn't been entirely certain until a few days ago, but now seemed like the perfect moment. "When we have children, we'll need those extra rooms." Garrett stared at her, his expression cycling through confusion to comprehension to absolute elation in the space of a few heartbeats. "Helena, are you saying you're going to have a baby in January, if my calculations are right? Are you happy?" Happy seemed too small a word for the emotion on his face. He swept her up in his arms, spinning her around and laughing with pure delight before setting her down gently, as though suddenly afraid she might break. "I'm beyond happy. I'm Helena. You've just made me the happiest man alive." "Good," she said, tears streaming down her face even though she was smiling. "Because I'm fairly happy about it myself." They told Margaret that evening, and she wept with joy and immediately began planning all the things she would make for her future grandchild. They told Mr. Montgomery and the other ranch hands, who offered congratulations and ribald jokes in equal measure. They told Mary and Mrs. Chen and everyone at church, and soon all of Socorro knew that the Jensens were expecting their first child. Through that summer and fall, Garrett and several of his cowboy friends spent every spare moment building the new house on the Jensen land. It was simple but solid, 4 rooms as planned, with good pine floors and real glass in the windows, and a stone fireplace big enough to heat the whole structure in winter. Helena helped when she could, though Garrett grew increasingly protective as her pregnancy advanced, insisting she rest rather than carry heavy loads or work in the heat. "I'm having a baby, not dying of consumption," she protested, when he physically removed a hammer from her hand one afternoon. "Humor me," he replied, kissing her forehead. "I finally have everything I ever wanted, you, our land, our baby on the way. I need to make sure nothing happens to any of it." They moved into the new house in November, when the cottonwoods along the creek had turned gold, and the air had taken on the crisp coolness of approaching winter. Their furniture was still sparse, cobbled together from pieces Garrett had built and items donated by friends and family. But Helena had made cheerful curtains for every window and a beautiful quilt for their bed, and the house already felt like home. Their son was born on a cold January night in 1883, delivered by Margaret and Mrs. Chen while Garrett paced anxiously in the parlor and wore a path in the new floorboards. When Margaret finally emerged to tell him he had a healthy baby boy, Garrett nearly knocked over a chair in his haste to get to Helena's side. She lay in their bed, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in one of the soft blankets Mrs. Chen had made. "Meet your son," Helena said softly as Garrett knelt beside the bed, his eyes fixed on the small, perfect face visible above the blanket's edge. "He's so tiny," Garrett whispered, afraid to touch something so delicate and precious. "He's perfect," Helena corrected, "and he needs a name." What should we call him? They discussed names for months without reaching a decision, but now, looking at his son's face, Garrett knew instantly. James Michael Jensen, after both our fathers." Helena's eyes filled with tears. "Papa would have loved that. Yes, James Michael Jensen." "Hello, little James. Welcome to your family." Garrett finally gathered the courage to reach out and touch his son's impossibly small hand, and when James's tiny fingers curled around one of Garrett's calloused fingertips, He felt something in his heart crack open and expand, making room for a love he'd never imagined possible. "I'll take good care of you both," he promised, looking from his son to his wife. "I'll work hard and build us a good life, and I'll make sure you always know how much you're loved." "You already do that," Helena said, reaching up to cup his cheek with her free hand. "Every single day, you already do that." The years that followed were filled with hard work and simple joys, with struggles and triumphs, with the slow, steady building of a life and a legacy. Garrett balanced his work for Mr. Montgomery with developing their own small ranch, gradually building up their herd from the original 10 head to 30, then 50, then more. Helena continued her sewing business when time allowed, though most of her energy went to raising James and managing their growing household. Margaret moved out to the ranch when James was 2, finally admitting that maintaining the boarding house alone was becoming too difficult. She took over a room in the Jensen house and proved invaluable, helping with James and the endless work of ranch life, while Helena and Garrett labored to make their dream sustainable. 2 years after James was born, Helena delivered a daughter they named Grace, who had her mother's brown eyes and her father's stubborn determination. 18 months after that came another son, Thomas, who was quieter than his siblings but watched everything with solemn green eyes. The Jensen house rang with children's laughter and the organized chaos of family life, and Garrett would sometimes stop in the middle of his work to simply marvel at how blessed he'd become. "Remember when we first met?" he asked Helena one evening as they sat on their porch, watching their children play in the last light of a summer evening. James was 7 now, teaching 5-year-old Grace how to skip stones in the creek, while 3-year-old Thomas toddled after them, determined not to be left behind. "You caught my flour sack," Helena replied, leaning her head against his shoulder, "and looked at me like I was something precious." "You were. You are." Garrett wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "Best day of my life meeting you in that general store. Even better than the day we got married. That's the second best day. Third best was when James was born. Fourth was Grace. Fifth was Thomas. I'm a lucky man, Helena Jensen. Luckiest man alive." Helena smiled, watching their children and thinking about the woman she'd been 5 years ago, sad and uncertain, preparing to marry a man she didn't love, believing her dreams had to be practical rather than passionate. She thought about the wedding dress made from flour sacks, about the cowboy who'd told her she was the most beautiful bride, about the risks they'd both taken and the life they'd built together from humble beginnings. "We're lucky," she corrected softly. "Both of us. We found each other when we needed to, and we had the courage to choose love over security, dreams over duty." "No regrets?" Garrett asked, though he knew the answer. "Not a single one." By the time James turned 10, the Jensen Ranch had grown into a successful operation, with over 100 head of cattle and 2 horses specifically for breeding. They'd paid off more than half their debt to Mr. Montgomery, who'd become like a second father to Garrett and a grandfather to the children. Helena's sewing business had evolved into a small shop in town, run with Mary's help, providing quality clothing to working families throughout the county. Socorro had grown too, pushing westward with new buildings and new families arriving from back east seeking opportunity in the territories. The Brooks family was still prominent. Samuel had married a banker's daughter from Albuquerque, and now had 3 children of his own, but the old scandal had long since faded into history, replaced by newer gossip and fresh dramas. Helena occasionally saw Samuel in town, and always greeted him politely, bearing no ill will toward the man she'd almost married. He seemed content enough with his lot, though she noticed he never quite met her eyes, as though looking at her reminded him of roads not taken and choices that couldn't be unmade. "You ever wonder what your life would have been like if you'd married him?" Garrett asked once, after one such encounter. "Sometimes," Helena admitted honestly. "But then I come home to you and our children and this life we've built, and I can't imagine wanting anything different." Marrying Samuel would have been safe and respectable, but it wouldn't have been this wild, wonderful, sometimes difficult but always meaningful adventure we're on together. Margaret lived to see all 3 of her grandchildren reach school age, and when she passed peacefully in her sleep one autumn night, the entire community turned out for her funeral. Pastor William spoke about her strength and kindness, about how she'd raised a daughter who exemplified those same qualities, and about the legacy of love she'd left behind in the family that surrounded her grave. "Your mother would be proud of you," Garrett told Helena that night as they lay in bed, his arms around her while she grieved. "Of the woman you are, the mother you've become, the life you've built." "I hope so," Helena whispered. "I tried to learn from her example to be strong when things are hard, to lead with love, to choose courage over comfort. You did more than try. You succeeded." The Jensen children grew up knowing they were loved, learning the value of hard work and honest dealing, understanding that success came not from money or status but from integrity and perseverance. James proved to be a natural rancher, fascinated by cattle and horses and the rhythms of ranch life. Grace was bookish and dreamy, always with a novel in her hand, talking about becoming a teacher someday. Thomas showed artistic talent, sketching everything he saw with increasing skill as he grew older. "They're all so different," Helena marveled to Garrett as they watched their teenage children one evening. James was 17 now, already doing a man's work on the ranch. Grace was 15, teaching younger children to read at the church on Sundays. Thomas was 13, his latest drawing spread across the kitchen table. "They got the best parts of both of us," Garrett said proudly. "Your brains and my stubbornness, or maybe the other way around. Either way, they're going to be fine people. We did well, didn't we?" Despite starting with nothing but love and flour sacks, we did better than well. We built something real and lasting, not just this ranch, but this family. That's worth more than all the money in the world. When James turned 18, Garrett officially made him a partner in the ranch operation, signing over a quarter share that would grow as the years went on. "I'm not getting any younger," Garrett said, though at 41 he was still strong and capable. "And you've earned this, son. You've worked as hard as any man could, and you care about this land the way I do. Someday, this will all be yours and your siblings, but for now, I want you to know you're not just my son, you're my partner." James, who had grown into a tall, serious young man with his father's work ethic and his mother's kind heart, actually had tears in his eyes as he shook his father's hand. "I won't let you down, Pa. You never have, and you never will. I'm proud of you, James, prouder than I can say." Grace eventually did become a teacher, starting a small school on the Jensen ranch that served children from all the surrounding families. She married a young minister named David Harper when she was 20, and they built a house on Jensen land, close enough to remain part of the family while establishing their own household. Their wedding was a joyous affair, and Helena wept happy tears throughout the ceremony, remembering her own wedding day and the flower sack dress that had started everything. Thomas moved to Santa Fe when he was 20 to study art formally, but he returned to Socorro every summer and eventually settled on the ranch permanently, building a studio where he painted the landscapes and people of New Mexico with skill that eventually brought him recognition throughout the territory and beyond. He never married, content with his art and his family and the bachelor quarters he maintained in one corner of the ranch. The years continued their steady march, bringing joy and sorrow, triumph and struggle, birth and death in their natural rhythms. Garrett and Helena celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary, surrounded by their children and grandchildren. James and his wife had given them 3 grandchildren by then, and Grace had 2 of her own. The ranch had prospered beyond their early dreams, now spanning 400 acres and supporting a herd of 300 cattle. Remember when we thought 200 acres was all we'd ever need? Helena laughed as they stood on their porch, surveying land that had taken decades to accumulate. I remember thinking I'd be lucky to have 50 acres and a roof that didn't leak, Garrett replied. Everything else has been Grace, your namesake, actually. Grace and blessing and more happiness than one man deserves. 1 man and 1 woman, Helena corrected, threading her fingers through his. We built this together, Garrett. Every acre, every accomplishment, every joy. It's ours jointly. Best partnership I ever entered into, he agreed, pulling her close. At 52, his hair was more silver than dark, and his face bore the deep lines of a lifetime spent outdoors, but his green eyes still looked at her with the same love and wonder they'd held the day he caught her flour sack in the general store. Helena herself was 48 now, her figure softened by age and childbearing, her hair streaked with white. But Garrett still told her regularly that she was the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen, and he meant it with his whole heart. They had grandchildren to spoil and a legacy to pass on, and when they sat on their porch in the evenings watching the sun set over land they'd worked and loved for decades, they would sometimes talk about that day in 1882, when a young woman with a heavy flour sack and a heavier heart had collided with a cowboy who'd been searching for home without quite knowing it. "I'm glad I didn't marry Samuel Brooks," Helena said during one such conversation, when they were well into their 60s and the ranch was thriving under James's capable management. "So am I," Garrett replied dryly. "Would have complicated things considerably." Helena laughed and swatted his arm affectionately. "You know what I mean. I'm glad I had the courage to break that engagement, to risk scandal and poverty and uncertainty for the chance at real love. Best decision I ever made." "Second best," Garrett corrected. "Best was saying yes when I finally got around to actually proposing to you, instead of just declaring my feelings and hoping you'd figure out what I meant." "You were nervous," Helena remembered fondly. "Your hands were shaking when you took mine." "Of course they were shaking. I was asking the most amazing woman I'd ever met to spend her life with a cowboy who had more ambition than assets. Terrifying moment. But I said yes." "You did. And you wore that flour sack dress that you'd made with your own hands, and you were the most beautiful bride any man could hope for." Helena felt tears prick her eyes, even after all these years. "You told me that on our wedding day. You're the most beautiful bride, you said, and I believed you. Because it was true then, and it's still true now. You're still the most beautiful thing in my world, Helena. Always will be." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun paint the New Mexico sky in shades of gold and crimson and deep purple. Their children and grandchildren were scattered across the ranch and the surrounding territory, building their own lives while remaining connected to the land and legacy that Garrett and Helena had established. The ranch would continue long after they were gone, a testament to what could be built when 2 people loved each other enough to risk everything for a chance at happiness. "No regrets?" Garrett asked, as he had so many times over the years. "Not a single one," Helena replied, as she always did. "Though maybe one small one. I never did get to see California like I dreamed about when I was young." "Then we'll go," Garrett said decisively. "We'll take the train to San Francisco, see the ocean, stay in a fancy hotel, eat in restaurants where someone else does the cooking. James can handle the ranch for a few weeks. It's time we had an adventure that doesn't involve cattle or drought or broken fences. Helena looked at him in surprise. Really, at our age, especially at our age. We've spent 40 years building this ranch, raising our family, being responsible and practical. I think we've earned the right to be a little impractical now, don't you? So they did. In the spring of their 41st year of marriage, Garrett and Helena Jensen boarded a train in Socorro and traveled west to California, seeing places they'd only read about in books and experiencing the ocean for the first time. They stayed in San Francisco for 2 weeks, exploring the city like young honeymooners rather than the 60-something grandparents they actually were, and when they returned home, they had stories to tell and memories to cherish. Worth the wait. Garrett asked as they pulled up to their ranch in James's wagon, seeing their children and grandchildren gathered on the porch to welcome them home. "Everything with you has been worth it," Helena replied simply. "Every struggle, every sacrifice, every moment of uncertainty. Because it all led to this, to a life full of love and meaning and joy." They continued on for many more years, watching their grandchildren grow and begin having children of their own, seeing the Jensen Ranch become one of the most respected operations in the county, knowing they'd built something that would last long after they were gone. They never stopped working entirely. Both were too invested in the ranch and too used to productive activity to simply retire. But they did slow down, letting the younger generations take on more responsibility while they enjoyed the fruits of their decades of labor. Garrett passed first, in his 78th year, dying peacefully in the bed he'd shared with Helena for 53 years. His last words were to tell her one more time that she was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen, and Helena held his hand and wept, grateful for every moment they'd had together while mourning that there wouldn't be more. She lived another 4 years, surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, telling stories about the old days when the ranch was just a dream, and she'd made her wedding dress from flour sacks because it was all they could afford. The dress itself still hung in a place of honor in her wardrobe, carefully preserved and occasionally shown to young brides who marveled that something so lovely could be made from such humble materials. "Beauty doesn't require expensive materials," Helena would tell them, the same lesson she'd learned long ago. "It requires love and effort and the courage to see potential in simple things. That's true of wedding dresses, and it's true of life." When Helena finally joined Garrett in the small cemetery on the hill overlooking their ranch, she was buried in that flour sack wedding dress, the one he'd told her made her the most beautiful bride. Her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren stood around her grave and remembered not just a woman who'd built a successful ranch, but a woman who'd chosen love over security, courage over comfort, and had lived a life of meaning and purpose because of it. The Jensen Ranch continued on, passed down through the generations, and every member of that sprawling family grew up knowing the story of how it all began with a young woman, a humble flour sack, and a cowboy who'd seen beauty where others saw only poverty. They learned that the best things in life can't be bought in stores or inherited from wealthy families, but must be built through love and hard work and the willingness to take risks for what truly matters. And sometimes, when the light was just right and the wind whispered through the cottonwoods by the creek, visitors to the Jensen Ranch swore they could see 2 figures standing on the porch of the old house, hand in hand, watching the sunset together, a cowboy and his bride, still beautiful after all these years, still in love, still together in the land they'd claimed, and the legacy they'd created from nothing more than hope and flour sacks and hearts brave enough to choose love above all else. Their story became legend in Socorro and throughout New Mexico, told and retold with varying degrees of accuracy, but always with the same central truth that real wealth isn't measured in money or status, but in love given and received, in courage displayed, and in lives well lived. The flower sack wedding dress was eventually donated to the local historical society, where it was displayed with a plaque reading, "Made by Helena Tucker Jensen in 1882, from simple materials, this dress represents the courage to find beauty in humble things and the strength to choose love over convention." Her husband told her she was the most beautiful bride, and she believed him because some truths transcend circumstances, and real beauty comes from the heart. And so the story ended as all good stories should, with love triumphant, with dreams fulfilled, with a legacy that lasted far beyond a single lifetime. Garrett and Helena Jensen had started with nothing but each other, and the courage to build a life based on love rather than practicality. And they'd created something that endured for generations. Their descendants continued to work the land, to value integrity over wealth, to choose love over convenience, and to remember that sometimes the most beautiful brides wear dresses made from flour sacks, and the best lives are built from the humblest beginnings. That was the legacy of Helena and Garrett Jensen, written not in gold or silver, but in the lives of all those who came after them, and in the memories of a community that never forgot the girl in the flour sack dress and the cowboy who loved her. It was a legacy built on simple materials and extraordinary love, and it lasted forever.